So everybody can hear me apparently. It's like very loud from here. Hello, again, welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Madison History Club. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Ramírez. She will give a fascinating talk and I'm really looking forward to hear it. Let me say a few words about the Madison History Club. Like, did you folks attend it previously, or is it the first time for you? First time. Okay, so great, welcome. The Madison History Club brings UW members, alumni, and folks from the broader Madison area together to learn and discuss about history. So everyone who is interested in history, everyone who has certain questions and wants to learn from our amazing faculty is more than welcome to be here. There will be some more great events coming up soon. Once Juliana told me will be on December 13th, and it will be hosted by our new faculty member, Michael Martocchio. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. And he will talk about the phenomenon of mercenaries. So mercenaries in war, which will also include a discussion about mercenaries in the current Ukraine-Russian conflict. So I hope I'll see some of you here. Before we get started, I would ask you to pass this around. And if you're not on this email list, why don't you, like, if you like this event, scan the QR code or add your name or email address so that you can get further information about this workshop. All right, so Professor Marla Ramírez is assistant professor at UW's history department and will talk today about her current book project titled Contested Illegality, Mexican Repatriation, Banishment, and Prolonged Consequences Across 3 Generations. And this book examines the history of citizenship and naturalization laws and immigration policies of the Great Depression era, focusing on the unconstitutional banishment of U.S. citizens of Mexican descent that tore apart thousands of families across the U.S.-Mexican border. And her talk today, Gender Banishment, will give us a kind of a preview of your current book project. Prior to coming to UW-Madison, Professor Ramírez held an assistant professorship at the San Francisco State University and a chancellor postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the university, a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard. And her research has been supported by, among others, by the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ramírez.
Thank you. Let me just get my mic. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I prepared this talk not as a formal presentation. I'm not reading a paper. It's more based on a lecture format because my students from my lecture series class 400 are here. So it's more of an interactive format. So with that said, if at any point you have any questions or comments, feel free to jump in. We don't have to wait until the end, but there's also time for Q&A at the end. This talk is based thematically based on my book project, but specifically on an article that I just published on the Latino Studies Journal that is about oral history methodology. So it's about the methodology that I employ in my research and how oral history is useful in my approach to oral history as a transgenerational approach where I interviewed 3 generations instead of only one person or one generation, as is more traditional in oral history, and the approach that I take to my interviews. but I'll be talking more about that as we go on to the presentation today. So to begin with, this is a brief overview of the breakdown of the presentation. So I'll give you a short background of the special issue where this paper appears. Then we'll transition to a more general historical background about the topic of the Great Depression and the great removals during that era, and the history of Mexican presence in the United States that led to the mass repatriation rates during the Great Depression because of the economic crisis. And then we'll zoom in and for the most of the part of the presentation, I'll be talking about oral history as a methodology and private collections that I use for my study. And then we'll transition to Q&A. I started here in 2019, in fall of 2019, as an assistant professor. And in that fall, I was invited to join a roundtable discussion about methodological approaches to document the histories and experiences of Latinx communities. And it was organized by a colleague of mine who also began with me in fall of 2019, and we met in the faculty orientation that fall, actually. And so she is in the Department of Sociology. Her name is Sara Rios. She's an assistant professor there. And so she organized this roundtable, and this is the people that she invited to participate. All of us began in fall of 2019, and all of us met in faculty orientation. And so Grace Voltaire is an assistant professor of Native American and environment, health, and community. Marilena Umbachano is no longer here, but at the time, she was an assistant professor in civil society and community studies. Edna Ledesma is professor in the Department of Planning and Landscape Architecture. And Almita Miranda is an assistant professor in geography and Chicana or Latino studies, and then myself. So we came together to talk about the methodological approaches that we take into our research. And we were in conversation during faculty orientation, we were sharing about our work, and we realized that we were all examining different topics about Latinx communities and excavating obscure histories and experiences, right? And so Sarah Rios asked, so what methodologies are you guys using in your research? And we started having a conversation about that led to her planning of this roundtable that eventually led to a special issue that Sarah and I co-edited, where we put the conversations that we initially had in this roundtable into a more formalized conversation among ourselves. And we began writing about our methodological approaches. That is something that I don't usually do as a historian. I don't really emerge in an analysis of my methodological approach or methodologies in general. So this is kind of out of my wheelhouse, but it really forced me to step back and think and analyze how I use oral history in archival research and why is it beneficial to center the voices of historically marginalized communities, right? So these are some of the photographs from that roundtable back in fall 2019. Then we have people from across the humanities and social sciences join us, and we had very fruitful discussion, so much so that we were so excited to further formalize a conversation into a writing project. So why a special issue? We realized that we were very well immersed in our own disciplines, obviously, but knew very little about other methodologies that people were using across the humanities and social sciences. And this became a good opportunity to understand different methodological approaches across the board. So there's two historians in the special issue, Janet Barragan Miranda, who later joined us, but she wasn't part of the initial roundtable, who is at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the Department of Latino Studies. And I are the historians. She does an analysis of archival research, microfilm specifically, looking at Spanish newspaper articles. And then I do the oral histories, and we have Edna Ledesma, who uses pláticas, and we have Sara Rios, who uses movement as a method. She follows her participants over a long period of time, more of ethnography ground, and I'll make the acid as ethnography. So that's kind of that conversation that came together in the special issue. And yeah.
I want to make sure everybody knows that you're talking about a special issue of a journal.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Lenora.
That's when instead of like random articles, you put all together, you know, all the articles in the journal volume are on the same theme.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's excellent point. Thank you so much for I appreciate that. And I said it was going to be interactive, so thank you for modeling that so beautifully. Yes, so for students, I used sometimes take things for granted. So thank you for that reminder. Yeah, and a special issue. So when you're reading secondary sources and you're reading an article, oftentimes these articles are standalone pieces that are submitted to journals, right? And a special issue is a bit different. That is a thematic collection of essays. So we come together under a theme. In this sense, it's under the theme of methodological approaches, right? Intersectional methodological approaches to be more precise for this issue. And so the essays are really in conversation with each other. Yeah, so
these are journal volumes. Are we here just want to see them?
Yeah.
If you open them up, they'll all be all random essays, but once in a while you have one where everything's in dialogue.
Exactly.
Awesome, because it's like a way of getting the book together.
Yeah, so it's more like mini chapters and it has an introduction, right, that binds all the individual articles together. Yeah, thank you for the clarification, Lenora. Yeah, and so in the introduction of that special issue that is binding all the articles together, we theorize intersectionality as a methodological approach. So intersectionality, as you may know, is a theory that used to analyze a person's whole and diverse experiences. So not thinking of a person only as a gender identified male or female or trans or non-gender or gender diverse, right? Or fluid or gender fluid. That one was escaping me. But also as through their ethnic or racial background, through their class status, through all of their identities as a whole, right? So that we understand their wholeness as a being, not only as one layer. And so that is a theoretical approach that is used often when working with historically marginalized communities. But here for the special issue, we realized that all of us were using intersectionality to develop research questions, examine sources, create partnerships with participants, and develop research tools. So we began to think of intersectionality not only as a theoretical lens of analysis, but also as a methodological approach. And so in our essays, we talk about how we use intersectionality to think about the wholeness of each person that we work with and the communities that we examine. And for now, I'm transitioning into my own essay that I contributed to this issue. And for my essay, I looked at specifically the method of oral history. And then I also examined the private collections that families who I interviewed had constructed to document their life experiences in regards to the Great Depression and the mass removals during that period. I first began this project as a grad student a few years back. And when I was a grad student, doing my master's thesis, I interviewed people. I was doing oral histories, and I was interested at that point in my career about the topic of undocumented immigrant populations. And I wanted to understand what factors led some people to go into the job market when they arrived to the United States as young adults, and what led other people to go into education, either higher education or high school route. And so one of the questions that I had in my interviews was, how do you identify yourself, right? And when I interviewed this young man, Jesus, he said, I am a U.S. citizen, but not legally recognized as one. And immediately I thought, well, cultural citizenship, right? They came at an early age. They were raised in the United States, so culturally they understand themselves as a citizen, but legally they're not U.S. citizens, right? But then in oral history, you are trained to never assume what an answer might mean, right? To always follow up and ask for clarification. So then I asked So what do you mean? Why do you understand yourself as a U.S. citizen, but are legally recognized as one? And he proceeded to explain that his paternal grandmother, that is a U.S. citizen. She was born in the United States, grew up here, and then when she was a child, the Great Depression hit, and there was this, she was kicked out, is what he said, right, out of the country. And later, and I was fascinated, right, by that answer. And my attorney hat came in, and I said, well, maybe you have an immigration case, right? And maybe you can have derivative citizenship, or your father can, and then he can eventually petition you as a derivative grandson of a U.S. citizen. Have you talked to an attorney? Have you tried to open an immigration case? Do you have any documents proving that your grandma was a U.S. citizen? And I kind of like dropped my interview guide to the side and then pursued this new line of questioning about the Great Depression and being kicked out, whatever that meant. I didn't really know anything about this history at this point, right? And so, long story short, they hadn't pursued any legal action, but they did have a birth certificate of the grandmother who had tried continuously to come back to the United States to open immigration petition for her 2 children and her husband, who were all Mexican born and citizens. And so I finished my master's thesis, but then immediately began reading everything I could come across for secondary sources about the Great Depression and these mass removals of Mexicans during that period. I went into do archival research. I switched my topic for my dissertation into the history of mass deportations or removals during the Great Depression, right? And so I went into the archives and found fascinating things. This great documentation, unlike other histories that might be more marginalized, this history was very well collected in the archives, governmental records, council communications between council members in Mexico and the United States, people petitioning the council and governments for assistance to either be removed because they weren't finding employment, they were denied employment here in the United States, or to once they were in Mexico to be able to come back because their children or wives were U.S. citizens. So I started seeing all these hints that Jesus was referring to, right? U.S. citizens who found themselves in Mexico all of a sudden they were entangled in these mass removals, right? And trying to reclaim their citizenship and reestablish themselves back in the United States. Writing even to the president, letters to the president, right? Writing to different local and state representatives in both sides of the U.S. Mexico border. So there's this rich documentation, but I wanted to know the more personal stories, right? What happened to them besides these letters? Were they ever assisted? Were they successful in coming back and reestablish their citizenship? Are there more children and grandchildren who had prolonged consequences of these mass removal efforts? And I wasn't finding that in the institutional archives anywhere. And I looked everywhere in the United States that I could. I looked in Mexico, and there were only hints about the U.S. citizen experiences, right? And the secondary literature, the books and articles that have been published about the topic largely focus on the experiences of Mexican men, because those were richly documented in the archival sources, right? And so not surprisingly, the secondary literature was covering those topics, right? And we all know what secondary and primary sources are. We covered that in class, right? So far, so good? Yeah, okay. So then I decided to use oral history as a way to capture the detailed cross-generational experiences and see if there were any consequences across generations, or if that was just something that happened and then Jesus was the exception, right? That he did not benefit from derivative citizenship, but I wanted to know more. So that's how I started using oral history for my now book project. At the time, it was my dissertation. And I soon realized that the significance of terminology too, right? The secondary literature and the primary sources both use deportation sometimes in the records that implies that a non-citizen person can be legally removed or expelled to his or her home country, right? So it's a formal process of removal, right? And there's an immigration court hearing and a whole systematic process that takes place for deportation. Repatriation was the rule of the land, unofficially the rule of the land, and then officially a binational agreement between Mexico and the United States when removing about 1 million Mexicans from the United States, and about 60% were U.S. citizens, right? And repatriation is refers to a return to the homeland or patria, suggesting a voluntary return. So I realized that repatriation was not adequate as a terminology because it was a good description for people who wanted to leave, right? Who said, you know, there's a lot of xenophobia happening because of the Great Depression. There's no job prospects, being denied welfare assistance. So I want to leave, right? And that was a voluntary decision. People wanted to leave. So that is repatriation fits for that group. But there were other people who did not want to leave, and they were coerced to leave, or found themselves in immigration raids and then forced to leave, even if they were U.S. citizens, because there was a racial profiling tactics at play, right? So then I, in conversation with the participants and the literature that I was reading, I decided to use banishment instead. Most of the participants wouldn't use repatriation. Even if they were familiar with the term, they will say they kicked us out, right? As kind of this forced thing that happened to them, that they felt that they were unwanted or undesired, not recognized as citizens, right? So banishment I define as the coerced or illegal expulsion of U.S. citizens to their so-called home country, usually the ethnic country of origin. However, in the primary sources, I see that both the U.S. government and the Mexican government prefer the term repatriation over deportation or banishment or illegal coerced removals. The United States, because they are invested in removing undocumented immigrants, and they know that U.S. citizens are entangled in this process, and in order to turn a blind eye to those who are U.S. citizens, they stick to the term repatriation, right? But Mexico is also complicit. The Mexican government is also very complicit in this process. It becomes eventually a binational agreement, like I said earlier. And the United States is also coming out of the 1910 Revolutionary War, trying to establish themselves as a nation state. And through that process, they create this patriotic nationalistic discourse of being Mexican, even if you don't live in Mexico, you live abroad, you're still a citizen of Mexico, and the loyalty of the government is to you regardless of where you reside. So they're really invested in this term of repatriation, even if they're bringing back U.S. citizens, right, who are children and wives of Mexican nationals. So in essence, both governments ignore or turn a blind eye to the U.S. citizens who are displaced. So they are really ignored by both governments, and they find themselves trying to establish themselves, but in Mexico, and then coming back to the United States, but not legally protected by either nation, right? So to transition to a more historical background, the mass removals have been documented in the secondary literature in different periods over time. So during the 1950s, there's a lot of secondary sources that came out, it's documenting this history. And then in the 1970s, we had another increase of secondary sources documenting this history. And then we see it again in the 90s and early 2000s. And in every period, when we see an increase of the historiography that is documenting this history, most of it uses the term repatriation, but also focuses on the experiences of Mexican immigrant men, especially farm workers or rural workers who were removed during this period. This is a map from the book Unwanted Mexican Americans, published in 1974 by Abraham Hoffman, that provides a map to document the places where people, Mexican and ethnic Mexicans, Mexican and Mexican Americans concentrated prior to the Great Depression, and where they were removed from. So the thicker the arrow is, the bigger the number of people that were removed for that locality. So you can see that is highly concentrated in the Southwest, but then you see some locations in the Midwest. And then later, they are removed mainly through border towns first, but then later, they are sent in trains and other transportation services well into the south of Mexico to prevent return migration. So the idea was the farther they are relocated, the harder it is for them to come back, right? So this is the 1970 study, right? And then later studies show us that not only were ethnic Mexicans, both U.S. citizens, are not concentrated in the Southwest, like California, Arizona, and Texas, but also in Illinois and Indiana, as Hoffman pointed out, but they also were found across the United States, right? Throughout the Southwest, even in New York, Alaska, and Alabama and Alaska. And so they were well spread throughout the United States. So unlike earlier studies that largely focused in Texas or California, in the 90s and 2000s, more studies started focusing at a national analysis of repatriation, right? And what happened across the nation. By chance or coincidence, the railroad system had been constructed and passed through the cross national lines, passed through the states where Mexicans and Mexican Americans concentrated in mass. So it became the transportation of choice for the removal rates because of the accessibility of placing people in trains and then removing them from whatever part of the United States into the interior of Mexico. And ironically though, Mexican and Chinese immigrants were at the forefront of the construction and maintenance of this railroad system, right? That later was used to remove them from the country. There were other incentives to use the railroad system as a transportation of choice for the removals. Both Mexican and U.S. companies in Mexico and the United States were offering discounted rates if people were being, if the removal rates included people of 200 or more. And so for an individual passenger, it will be $12.60 to see the Juarez from the interior central United States. And it was discounted to $10.60, so $2 was a significant discount, but only if it was 200 passengers or more, right? And different prices were discounted to different parts of the country. So then having mass immigration rates became the norm, because the more people you send out, the cheaper it is to expel them, right? And the rationale was a best cost-benefit analysis. During the time of the Great Depression, there's an economic crisis, removing undocumented immigrants will allow the government, the U.S. government, to save money to focus on U.S. citizens, which all makes sense, right? But then what happens to those who are U.S. citizens remains a question, right? They were either racially profiled or denied the right to remain in the United States because of their Mexican ethnicity, not their citizenship status. There were debates at all levels of government about citizenship and exclusion during this time. Secretary Doug was appointed as the Secretary of Labor, and he heavily pushed to pass an immigration quota to include Mexico. The quota system had never included Latin America or Mexico specifically because of the labor dependency, right? So as much as immigrant workers depended on the income generated by working in the United States, the United States government also depended on cheap disposable labor of Mexican workers, right? So it's a two-way. It's a codependency is the term that I'm looking for, right? That both the government of Mexico and the government of the United States benefit from at the expense of immigrant workers who are displaced oftentimes, right? And labor rights are violated. So I just want to show this newspaper article that really heavily pushed at the time to have an immigration quota to include Mexico. So the xenophobia and exclusion was at the forefront. So when these immigration debates were covered daily and discussed at all levels of government, then justifications for the removals of U.S. citizens was not really questioned because they were already seen and understood as undocumented or undesired, right? So immigration raids happen throughout the United States, and one of the most infamous ones happened in the Placita Olvera on February 26, 1931. And the Placita Olvera is a cultural mecca in Los Angeles, California, where different ethnic groups come together to socialize in weekends or evenings. And it's a plaza. People come there to eat, to rest in the evenings or weekends, to socialize with other people. And it's an open space, as you can see here in the photograph. During this immigration raid, 400 people were surrounded and questioned if they didn't have immigration documents to prove that they were U.S. citizens. Then they will walk across the street literally to the LA Union train station, place on trains, and then removed to Mexico. Once in Mexico, they had to either find a way to prove they were U.S. citizens to come back, or many people were stuck there. The people that I interviewed didn't know that they could have gone to the U.S. consulate in Mexico and asked for copies of the birth certificates. They assumed that they had to come back to the United States, go to the city council where they were born, and get a copy of the birth certificate there, or to the churches where they were baptized and get baptismal records there to prove their U.S. citizenship. And so that meant that people were in Mexico for 20 to 40 years at a time, trying to find ways to prove their citizenship to come back and then reestablish themselves here, and then open immigration cases for the children who had been born in Mexico after their removal, after they were removed. And even though the vast majority of removals happened during the height of the Great Depression, from 1929 to 1932, they took place over 4 different consecutive periods, extending from 1921 to 1944. And they were called different things at different periods. And in every period, there were people who were leaving voluntarily out of their own accord, and people who were coerced to leave, or people who were forced to leave, right? And the estimates range anywhere from, in the historiography, range anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million. But my estimates, based on the research I conducted, it's about 1 million people, but it's still 60% were U.S. citizens, which is a significant number. So fast forward, and this is a big gap in time and the chronology, and we don't do this as historians, but because of time, I don't have the time for this presentation to walk you across time and space for this history. But so I'm moving us from the 1930s to 2012. Forgive me, it's not usual historians, I know. But in 2012, California, the state legislature passed an apology act, formally apologizing for their role in illegally removing U.S. citizens from the state. And a few years later, the different city councils, including the LA City Council and Anaheim City Council, also passed their own apology acts, apologizing for removing people from those cities specifically. This is the first and only official apology from the U.S. government. The Mexican government has not acknowledged their role in this forced relocation processes and removals. Michigan is another state who also passed an apology act, or not passed, proposed an apology act, but it didn't materialize, it wasn't signed into law. And as part of the California Apology Act, which was indeed signed into law, there's this commemoration plaque outside or adjacent to La Placita Olvera, where the infamous immigration raid happened in 1931 that I mentioned a few slides back. And when I was conducting research for my book, I had all the primary sources that you can think about, and I had all the secondary literature covered, but I still needed a community. I hadn't found community members that had lived through this historical moment to interview, right? And it's hard to track it down because there's no record showing where they reestablish themselves, if they ever came back, and if they came back, there's no immigration question at the border asking if they were banished and then replaced, right? I mean, and then relocated back to the United States. So I was really excited when I came across a flyer announcing this event, that they're gonna be a commemoration of a plaque. And I was hoping that families survivors of banishment and families who were relocated back to the United States were gonna be part of this event. So I went to the event, very hopeful, and sure enough, there were families there who then I introduced myself to and explained my research topic, my interest in their stories, and they generously opened their stories and their homes to me. And these are the 4 families I included in my study. The population was dying, and I see a dying population now. People were in the 80s and 90s when I was doing my interviews. So I have a limited sample of interviews because of that reason. But I'm really fortunate that I was able to do a transgenerational oral history approach, interviewing 3 generations in each family. So the first family is the Rodriguez Molina family, who Trinidad, photograph here, was banished in 1922 to Jalisco, Mexico. The other family is the Yanez de Anda family, who the 2 sisters, Consuelo and Virginia, were banished to Zacatecas in 1929. And the third family is the Robles de Llegas family. I interviewed Sarah Marie here, who was banished in 1932, also to Zacatecas. And then the last family is the Espinosa family. I interviewed Ramona, who was banished in 1933 to Baja California. And so each family experienced banishment in very unique ways, and some of them experienced prolonged consequences, some of them not at all. And so that's the analysis that I employ in my book, supplemented by other collected oral histories, one generational oral histories that had been archived in California and Michigan. I'll skip this actually because of time. And so when I started interviewing the families, I initially, as an oral historian, began doing individual oral histories, right, which is each person in the family. But it soon became obvious to me that people understood and remembered this historical moment in very different ways based on their own personal experiences, based on the generation in the family, right? So then I decided to bring them together after interviewing each member of the family, and in a setting of a kind of a focus group setting, borrow from sociology approach, and do a transgenerational oral history. And so I put them in conversation with each other, and what I learned is that they were able to really borrow from each other, or not borrow, but really jump out of each other's memories. And the individual memories, sometimes they were blurry, or there were gaps in how they remember things or what they remember. And then when they came together, if somebody will remember a specific thing, that would jog with the memory of somebody else to think about something else that wouldn't come out otherwise. It was also an opportunity for them to resolve some unresolved conflicts, right? So one of the families, Sarah Marie's grandson, Sarah Marie had a very strategic process of reestablishing herself in the United States. She came first, and she will send for 2 children at a time. She had 10 children. And so she will save money and then open immigration petitions and then bring 2 children. And she went from the oldest to youngest. And her rationale was that she will bring the oldest so they could start working and saving money to open the next immigration petition, right? She didn't know that the minor children who were under 21 could automatically benefit from derivative citizenship, right? She thought that she had to open a formal immigration family petitions. And so one of her sons that I interviewed, Chabelo, he was one of the youngest children in the family. So that meant it took him it took him about 10 years for him to be able to come to the United States, right? So there were some unresolved questions, right, that he had. in the individual oral history, he said, I will never imagine doing the same thing that my mom did to me. My son is the age I was when my mom left me. And I would never ever leave my child and go to another country, right? And I was like, that's really complicated because these unresolved conversations, right? And because it's very traumatic personal experiences, people were not often talking about these issues with each other. They knew that happened, but there were no real in-depth conversations about mixed feelings of how things happen, right? And that the approaches that the matriarch who was banished and then returned took to reestablish herself in the United States. So then in the group interview, then Chabelo, we were like going back and forth in one of the questions that I had, and then Chabelo asked his mom, how did you have the courage to leave me when I was so young? And then she said, look, and then he said, I would never do that to my son. And he's like, look, pues mira, she said, well, look, you can do whatever you want with your son and you can raise your son however you want. I did what I had to do to give yourself, you and your siblings, an opportunity. And so Chabelo, the way that I analyze this, right, is that Chabelo wanted acknowledgement for his suffering, and he felt that he really struggled when he was left with relatives in Mexico. And then his mother wanted him to recognize that it was a hard decision for her, but she was thinking of their well-being too in the long term, right? So then I had to step in and kind of play the mediator, right? Unexpected, because I'm not trained in, as a family counselor of any sort. But also give an opportunity to help them start, not conclude or not find closure, but begin a family conversation about these very complicated realities that happened years ago, but there's still very strong feelings and emotions, right, that have been unresolved. So it is my hope that these group interviews will also serve as a starting healing place where they can have longer, complex, more in-depth and hard conversations after I left the room. But I also realized that each family member had a rich private art collection where they had archived different documents and objects that documented their experiences of banishment that range from U.S. birth certificates, pictures, letters, and legal documents. And I'll show you some of those now. And I'll make it time. Okay. Trinidad Rodriguez had a very complex case in trying to reestablish her citizenship because it was her that took the longest for the family to interview to come back to the United States. And when she finally came back to the United States, she was able to secure her copy of her birth certificate and try to open an immigration case, but then died unexpectedly at a young age and was never able to finalize an immigration petition for her family. So now the son is trying to open an immigration case through his mother, but the Mexican documents have some clerical mistakes in them. So she was born in Redlands, California, and for instance, this document said she was born in Reglas, California, not Redlands, which is the closest phonetic spelling to Redlands because of the language barrier, right? And other documents said she was born in Los Angeles, California, which is a closer or a familiar Spanish term that is easy to spell. So if they will say, oh, she was born in Redlands, and then probably I imagine they will say, how do you spell that? And they will probably say, it's next to LA or adjacent to LA. And it's like, oh, let's put Los Angeles then, right? And so that small, seemingly insignificant decision at the local level in Mexico now has great impacts on an immigration petition because her birth certificate and her death certificate had different locations of birth. And immigration doesn't believe that that's the same person. So now the family has opened a court case in Mexico to try to correct the document that has taken them more than 5 years now, and it's still unresolved. Last time I checked with them, it's still unresolved. So that is one of the unintended consequences of these removals, right? The other family, Dañez and the family, when I interviewed the sisters, Consuelo and Virginia, they brought out a picture to the table where the interview took place in their home, and it was a picture of their parents, right? And the parents are the first members in their family to have come to the United States, and then they were born here in the United States. And when they brought out the picture, I said, "Oh, so can you tell me more about this photograph, right? I know it's your parents, like, when was it taken?" And it looks like a romantic moment that is captured, right? A very captured romantic moment, almost like a selfie, if we put it in context of nowadays, right? But to my surprise, this is an immigration photograph. In the 1940s, 1940s, people were photographed. 1940s, actually, people were photographed whenever they entered the border, if they came here legally, and it will be a group photograph. So if the whole family came, the whole family will be photographed. If a person came, then the individual will be photographed. They came together, so they were photographed together. But their hair is pulled back. The camera is really focused on their faces, as if the immigration agent wanted to capture every little detail of who they are. And these documentations, this collection of photographs of people coming into the United States became a visual record of what we imagine to be undocumented immigrants, right? Regardless of their legal status. And then I realized, they also showed me this photograph that is the last picture the family has of Virginia and Consuelo before they were removed. And I soon realized that every family has a last picture in the United States. They said, "Oh, this was a year before we were removed, or 5 years," but they have a last picture before they were removed as a visual record that they were actually in the United States, which I found really interesting. This is a picture, the last picture of Sarah Marie taken before she was removed in Pasadena, California. And then other families had people who really trained themselves in archival research. So the Espinosa family, the daughter rather of Ramona Guadalupe, went into the San Miguel archives in California and took training classes in how to conduct archival research, and then went into the archives and tried to find any documents or any evidence of her mother's family's presence in the United States before or during the Great Depression and before she was removed. And this is a census data that documents the address and the name of the family before they were removed in 1933. And if you notice, here is a signed seal of authenticity. And she said that when she was doing research in the reading room, she will see people coming in and getting this certification of their documents for immigration purposes. So if they go to court for an immigration hearing or whatnot, they needed to have it certified. So she started certifying all her documents, not because she had an immigration case pending or she wanted to open an immigration case because they were all U.S. citizens, but because she wanted to make the documents extra official to say this history is real, this history really happened to us, it's not hearsay, it's not family stories, it's official history, which I thought it was very interesting in how people wanted to formalize their history, because there's no, at the time when she was doing this, there was no formal apology from California or formal recognition from the Mexican government or the U.S. government that this injustice really happened to U.S. citizens. And this mass relocation took place during the Great Depression. So that's how I was able to benefit not only from the oral histories, individual oral histories and transgenerational oral histories, but also from the private collections that families had archived to document their histories. And that's another set of sources that I use for the analysis of my now book in progress. And I'll conclude here and open up for Q&A.
Any questions? Thank you so much. First of all, that was great. Like for me as an European, it's so interesting to hear the story, especially since I'm also conceptualizing my PhD right now.
Yeah.
And, learning about all these methodologies. Yeah, that's very relevant.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
So you said the driving force.
Hold on a second.
You said the driving force was economic. What was the actual effect on that? Was it like, as far as the United States side, was it successful? And was there a positive or a negative effect in Mexico as far as having an influx of labor and people?
Yeah, good question. Initially it was an economic factor, right? We were in time of the greatest economic crisis to date at that point, right? And initially the suggestion was to remove all immigrants from the undocumented immigrants from the country, right? And the cost benefit analysis, it wasn't sustainable, right? It wasn't effective. So then the railroad train system made sense economically to remove Mexicans, and the proximity between Mexico and the United States meant that it was cheaper and faster to target Mexicans. So then Mexicans became targeted, but that doesn't mean they were the only people who were targeted. Other groups were also targeted, other European groups and other ethnic and racial groups, including the Filipino communities. The Mexican repatriation rates were never formalized into law, but in 1935, the Filipino Repatriation Act became law, and it's basically modeled after the Mexican immigration rates or removals, right? There were some benefits, I suppose. There's documentation, obviously. There's economic analysis about how much do we save if we remove 500,000 Mexicans? How much do we save if we remove 1 million Mexicans? And the estimates were compared to the economic question was how much would have to spend in welfare assistance if they remain, and how much we would spend to remove them, and then what will be the leftover of the money that they're going to be able to ask for welfare assistance, right? In that economic formula, the savings were a significant and motivational force to continue the removals, but there were some assumptions made, right? The assumption was that Mexicans were going to stay in welfare assistance for prolonged periods of time for the 10-year analysis. And people were also asking for employment. And in the New Deal, we had different work programs, right, to help people come out of the depression and recession and to start working. But Mexicans were excluded from New Deal jobs. So they were denied employment. So then there were all these factors at play, right? The economic analysis was used as the justification, but at the ground, people were denied both aid and employment, then forcing them to either decide to leave or being forced or coerced to leave. Yeah. So the analysis might be lacking. Yeah.
Since California has officially recognized their actions, have they done anything to fix the situation or let those descendants back in as citizens?
Yeah, that's a good question. And no, apology acts usually are symbolic gestures, right? That they recognize that it was a wrongdoing, but there's no reparations that have taken place. So people who are still undocumented, for instance, are asking for reparations in the terms of having a immigration path, specifically for people who are descendants of banished people, right? But there's no real action for to remedy that wrongdoing. It's just recognizing that it was wrong and they apologize.
Do you know of any violent struggle that how strongly did the U.S. government enforce this policy? Like you said that they asked for the documentation during the raid, and if they didn't have it, they were funneling the trains. Were the people that tried to run away? Were the people who resisted?
Yeah, good question. And yeah, so there were people. There's documentation in the archival evidence in the primary sources where people, council members and immigration officers are in conversation because there's people who are realizing that they are in this train and they're headed to Mexico, right? So they are escaping in mid-route and running away. So they're basically leaving the train, jumping the trains. And then there's discussions about locking the doors so that people don't kind of leave the trains. And there is records of actually some trains who had people locked up and they weren't told where they were going or where they were putting these trains. But there's resistance for sure. There's also nonprofit organizations and who are protesting what's happening, and they're saying that it is that it's illegal, that it's unjust. They're trying to defend people who are being coerced to leave, and trying to help them stay. So there's mutual aid communities that were organized to fundraise money. So different local communities came together, created dance hall events or other events and raise money so that they could serve as a kind of a welfare assistance for people who were destitute, so that they wouldn't have to go to a state or local welfare agencies and then put in repatriation lists or banishment lists. So there were all these kinds of ways that people could escape or were avoiding removal, and many people did stay actually. So it's not that it was a complete removal of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, yeah. So some people did stay. So the ones that I discussed here, the people who were actually removed.
What was it like doing the oral interviews? I know you talked a little bit about it, but like with the families, like what was the setting for the interviews, and did you prep them on what questions you were going to ask beforehand, or what did that look like?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so in oral history practice, is a best practice in the method to always give participants a copy of the interview guide before the interview happens. And that serves different purposes, right? One is that it allows people to know the things that you're thinking about and the questions you're going to be asked, so they can start stimulating their memories, right, and thinking about the questions. But also, it gives them an opportunity to say, I'm not comfortable addressing these themes or these questions. And then we work in collaboration to take them out, or to also say, oh, you're thinking about this, and I want to talk about this, right? And then creating new questions. And then during the interview, I always explain, and it's also another best practice in oral history, to say that they're not, they don't have to answer any question that don't feel comfortable, even if they agree during the process of the interview guide. And they can stop that interview at any point in the process, so they have the right to stop participation, obviously with no consequence. Yeah, so that's for the interview guide. And then most of the interviews took place in people's homes, just because they feel more comfortable in those locations. And I offer different options. So some option was I reserve library rooms, quiet rooms to have the interviews. Some people wanted to do it in public spaces, like a coffee shop, which was kind of a pain in the butt to transcribe because of the background noise. Having like a Starbucks background music playing and noise was really hard to transcribe that interview. But if they wanted to do that because they feel more comfortable there, then there's nothing I can do, right? Now we have more fancy technology with the recorders that block out background noise. But back then, when I was a broke grad student, I was using a very cheap audio recorder that didn't have the advanced technology that I have now. Yeah, and so it is a collaborative process where I do all this background research and this archival research and secondary sources reading to know how to understand the era and the topic and the history, and then construct the interview guide. But then I know that they have different lived experiences that I might not be privy to, so then that collaboration is important.
One of my questions is, so if the more accurate term for the more coerced and forced removal is banishment, and then repatriation refers to voluntarily leaving, what does true repatriation look like, and was there overlap in the two processes?
Yeah, it was. Good question. Yeah, so repatriation is when. So repatriation actually began after World War I as a binational effort between the United States and Mexico, and it was so there were wartime temporary work programs where Mexicans were brought to the United States to work in job sectors that needed workers because American men were at war, right? And so in agriculture, railroad, mining, in Michigan, in the automobile industry, right? Well, more in the 30s that was. But so they were Mexican men specifically were brought to work in the United States during the time of war, during World War I. And then the recession that happened shortly after World War I ended, so they were promised run transportation, so they will be brought here, given housing, employment, and then transportation back when their temporary contract expired. But because of the recession that followed the war, that meant that employers were not covering the return transportation for Mexican workers here. So then they started contacting council members, Mexican workers started contacting council members, and the council members started contacting the federal government of Mexico, and then they agreed on having a repatriation program. That's how the repatriation terminology was introduced during this period. And that meant that the Mexican government will step in and cover the transportation expense to return temporary workers back to Mexico after World War I. And then that was kind of borrowed and used during the Great Depression because there were people who actually did want to leave, and they said, you know, there's no opportunities here, and we have family in Mexico. We were here temporarily anyway, so we want to return. And so then they also seek out help from the council members in their cities. And then the federal government stepped in and also helped in the repatriation efforts. But then that became kind of the broad terminology and justification that it was voluntary to obscure the deporters and the forced removals as well.
So all actual repatriation efforts are initiated by people who want to leave, right?
Yeah, essentially. And then they contact their representatives and ask for assistance. Yeah.
Thanks. This is really interesting work. I'm really enjoying it. Your discussion of repatriation and how that has to do with patria and homeland and love of country is reminding me of that 19th century nationalist discourse about how much everyone is supposed to really love your country.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, I studied Eastern Mediterranean, of the 20th century efforts in the 1920s between the new nationalist states of Greece and Turkey to repatriate everybody to the right spot, right? So what had a few decades before been the Ottoman Empire, right, in which there was a lot of mixture of people who identified as Greek and as Turkish. In 1922, we had these secular nationalists who Ataturk and Venizelos actually grew up together in Thessaloniki and were neighbors. There were people who spoke Turkish and people who spoke Greek and people who were Orthodox and people who were Muslim, but they all wanted to be secular nationalists. So they were agreed, all right, the Greeks and the Turks can't live together. Let's get all the Turks to go to Turkey and all the Greeks to go to Greece, right? So there is a lot of pain, right? And there's songs about trains. Just mentioning a train will bring tears to the eyes of people who lived in the slums in Athens when they were kicked out of places their families had been for ages. So the kicked out is also the term for the people who didn't really feel that love of country. But I just, on the one hand, I was thinking, here are other communities in very different places for which we have lots of records of those the people who didn't want to go back to the patria, and they're there. So that might give you some analogies of people of that displacement and some more records and more stories of people experiencing almost exactly the same time, a very similar story. In the Greek and Turkish one, it seems that what was thought of as sort of the ethnic nationalism is in some ways even stronger here because it screwed up both economies. There was no economic fig leaf. Right. Yeah. This is messing everything up because the ethnic stuff was so important. And one of the things that I find is like most tragic, ironic in history is that once these guys had decided the Greeks and the Turks couldn't possibly live with each other, they had to figure out how you tell them apart. And they couldn't, right? Because you have Greek speaking Muslims and Muslim, Turkish, it was all mixed up. So they had to decide, are we going to divide them by language? But too many people are bilingual. So they decided to divide them by religion, even though Venizelos and Ataturk were total secularists, right? So all the Orthodox wound up in Greece and all the Muslims wound up in Turkey, a lot of mixture, right? So that sad, difficult story makes me want to question when they were repatriating people who wanted to stay where they were, what were the criteria? You use the word, Mexicans who are U.S. citizens. What were the criteria by which people were distinguished? How do you figure out who needs to go home to that homeland?
Yeah, it's a really good
Sorry
question.
it's so long.
No, it's fascinating, and I need to follow up with you on those records because I'm trying to think in my revisions of the introduction for the book, and it's what's happening globally, right? This is not happening in isolation, and it's more in different programs that are happening throughout Europe, throughout other countries, throughout the world, right? So I want to know how it looks in other places. So anyway, so thank you for sharing that. But yeah, so the way that the people were put in a list for removal was through, and I didn't include that slide here, but it was through the head of the household. So people who were unemployed, so people who were head of households who were unemployed, then were placed in repatriation list, right? And then whenever they went to ask for public assistance, they were denied, and then the assistance they were offered was a one-way paid transportation ticket to Mexico, right? So that meant that it was that usually Mexican men who were the head of the household, even if the married women who was a U.S. citizen and married or children who were U.S. citizens were also working and independent because of the model of the head of the household. As long as the father or husband became unemployed, then the entire family was put in a repatriation list because they were seen as economic dependents of the father or husband, even if that wasn't so. And so that's how U.S. citizens were also enlisted. And some of the, I have a list in other presentations that I've given where the archival records show the head of the household at the top, usually a Mexican national, Mexican citizen, and then all the children, the wives, the grandchildren, sometimes the daughters and son-in-laws are listed as well. So even not only the nuclear family, but extended family were all U.S. citizens, right? But because of the head of the house was a Mexican national or undocumented immigrant and unemployed, then the entire family was targeted for removal if they were living together or in proximity to each other. So that's largely how it was rationalized. And then the other way of targeting U.S. citizens was to also do those mass immigration rates that took place in public spaces or spaces of work. And so they will come in, and then if they didn't have documentation to prove they were U.S. citizens, and then they find themselves in these trains or other transportation in their way to Mexico.
Speaking of the 60%, you said 60% of them were United States citizens. Was that 60% primarily offspring, as you said, that were from the head of household, or, and I guess if not, what was the other trend that created that large number?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Will, because the immigration documents that group that listed people who were being removed. So every train load will have a list of people that were part of that train, right? People were listed by nationality. So it was Mexican national, U.S. national, right? So that meant that we don't know if a Mexican national was a legal permanent resident or a naturalized U.S. citizen or had an immigration visa of any sort. Because their nationality was Mexican, then that person was targeted even if they had legal status here, right? So then later we find that a lot of the heads of the households were actually also legal residents or citizens themselves. And then also entangled in these removals, right? So then the classifications were murky. So then it led to the understanding that were foreign, and foreign was based on nationality. Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Professor Ramírez?
Oh, and I also wanted to go back. Sorry, I just remember, Leonora, that I didn't address one part of your question. I wanted to go back to how people were understood socially, right? And yeah, culturally, that is, and that ties to your question, Will, too. So people were perceived as Mexican, right? Mexican immigrants in the United States because of their phenotype or physical appearance, right? And they were seen as undecided foreign or usurpers of American jobs, draining the welfare system, similar kind of bias returns that we still hear today, replicated against different ethnic and racial groups. But once in Mexico, some of them thought, okay, maybe we'll find acceptance in Mexico because we are now in Mexico, we're Mexicans, right? Even if only ethnically, not in terms of nationality, right, or citizenship. But they weren't, right? They weren't welcome with open arms in Mexico either. They find a lot of xenophobia, racism, classism in Mexico. They were seen as agringados or to whitewash. Some of them only spoke English or spoke broken Spanish, right, or not fluent Spanish. And there were widespread Americanization programs here that began in the 1920s to Americanize immigrants of all ethnic and racial backgrounds. There were Mexicanization programs in Mexico during the 1930s and 40s to Mexicanize Mexicans coming back from the United States, right? So it's not a perfect world for ethnic Mexicans at the time, either in the United States or Mexico. They face the same kind of racist segregation and marginalization on both sides of the United States, right? When people say I'm Mexican American, that means I'm neither from here nor from there. It really meant that they didn't really belong or were accepted by either nation, socially, culturally, but also legally. They weren't protected or recognized as citizens of either nation either. Yeah, and then I was gonna go back to your question, Will, because I remember something else when I was escaping. Maybe it'll come back to me later.
If I may, I also have a question. Building on what you just said, so what exactly happened with all these people who had to cross the border and ended up in somewhere in Mexico? Like, what was their next step usually? Did they still have like kinship networks or like any like resources how to navigate through this?
Yeah, good question. And some did have, even if they had been here for decades in the United States, they had extended family who was still living in Mexico. So some families relocated back to where their families were residing, in the states where the families were residing. Other families had lost contact with family in Mexico, if they had any. So they found themselves making place and community in a random new location in Mexico or wherever they were relocated to, initially through different border towns, and then driven southern and southern down into Mexico, right? So it's a combination of factors, right? And then the Mexican government was doing the agrarian reform that meant taking land who had been expatriated by other foreign businesses or entities and trying to reclaim those lands and give ownership to Mexican citizens. So the idea that the Mexican government was selling kind of public-facing rhetoric, right, was that will bring Mexican and Mexican who are residing in the United States back to Mexico, who are being marginalized and mistreated in the United States. We'll bring them back to Mexico because they have this new set of skills in agriculture or railroad or different industries, and they'll help us advance our economy here. They were especially interested in agricultural, working with agricultural skills because of the agrarian reform. They wanted to create colonies, colonization projects, right? So have a specific land sectors where people will give land to cultivate and also live in. And then the idea was that they were superior Mexicans, right? Also this romanticization of a Mexican working in the United States, right? So they were superior working class Mexicans who had this new set of skills, and they will help Mexican economy drive and compete in agriculture and agricultural world transnationally with the United States. So that was a selling point, right? That when politicians were interviewed or planning the repatriation rates. In practice, however, only very few colonies did actually materialize, some in Oaxaca in the south of Mexico and some in Mexicali and northern regions of Mexico. But the vast majority were not given, were false promises, right? They were not given land or any support by the government, and then had to find themselves facing hunger, some starvation. Some people died because of lack of support or resources. So it was a mix of factors. It was no one blanket experience.
You said that some of it was based off phenotype, so if there was any white passing people or their children, were there any mixed people?
Yeah.
They still
Yeah, so definitely there's some people who were white passing, and that was white privilege, right? They weren't targeted or questioned or stopped in immigration rates, but there were also the other side of the coin. There's some interesting documentation in the archival sources where Filipino immigrants who can pass as Mexicans phenotypically found themselves in these immigration rates, put in these trains or removed, and found themselves in Mexico saying, I'm not Mexican, I don't speak Spanish, I'm a Filipino, right? And having to prove that they're actual Filipino, either or had citizenship in the United States oftentimes, and having to find a way to come back to the United States. So it went both ways, right? People who passed as white, who were Mexicans, who were able to use that to not be targeted in this public rates, but people who pass as Mexicans, either Filipino, and but imagine other ethnicities too. Indian folks also can pass as Mexicans. So imagine there's questioning or actual removals happening.
My question was very much on that. I was wondering, given your photographs of the families with the girls having the very American haircuts, American dressing, have you tried to ask people to line those photographs up and say, can you tell that they're Mexican? I mean, from those, it doesn't seem at all possible that we would say, oh, that's a Mexican family.
Yeah, and they were not understood as Mexican in Mexico, right? So they were seen as too Americanized precisely because of the haircuts and fashion, right? Virginia and Consuelo, the sisters here in the bottom, and they will say that they were using the bob cut haircut that was fashionable at the time. And in Mexico, that wasn't a fashion, right? Having long hair and braids was the norm, the fashion was socially acceptable. And in that rural town that they were relocated to, right? Not across the board, but in these specific locations. So they said they were called pelonas, that they had no hair, that their hair was too short, or like they were bullied for being not feminine enough, right? That they were not women, not ladylike. If they wanted to be boys, so their sexuality was questioned, right? So all these assumptions and biases and rejection happening also once they arrive in Mexico because they were socially American, right? When you live in a nation, you kind of escape the culture of that nation, so you're socialized and to the fashion or culture or language or whatever it might be.
So obviously we've been talking a lot about international banishment, but I can think of a pretty recent example of intranational banishment, which would be the Florida and Texas governors sending people to other states and stuff like that. Do you see any other parallels between these two cases? And do you think that there are, or what would you say is the best response for people across the country beyond perhaps just denouncing the cruelty?
Yeah, so I don't know that this banishment is relocation, right? Intra relocations from the border towns to different places in the United States. And the reality is that it really highlights how complex and inefficient our immigration system is, right? That even though we have a policy in hand for refugees, it hasn't been updated or revised to really deal with the crisis of displacement that we're facing in this day and time. And that I'm sure it will continue to displace people will continue to seek refuge abroad, either in the United States or other countries throughout the world. When I think about climate change, right? And the inaction about climate change, soon enough people who are going to be known as water refugees, I imagine, are going to be trying to find refuge in other places where there's water, unfortunately, right? Or water sources. And we haven't thought as a government, as a nation, through immigration laws about that. How do we deal with displacement through war, through hunger, through climate change, right? Do we address those needs of people who are going to be displaced and immigrating, or do we ignore it? And we have been ignoring many of these things that leads to a mass of influx of people coming in at one time, and then people don't know what to do, and then they're used as political pawns to make a political point without addressing the issue at hand, really. So I think we need to, as a nation, politicians really need to think about our immigration system and refugee laws to see if they're effective in order to solve the problem at the root, not only in time of election to use it as political arguments.
We have time for one or two more questions.
I was just wondering, I know it's a little different, but like I grew up in San Francisco, so like I learned a lot about the Japanese internment camps in World War II, and they would always show us this yearbook of all the like Japanese students just like crossed out with red X's and talking about how they left in the middle of the like school year and they just like one day just didn't show back up. And I was just wondering like how, like if you in your research, how communities in the US reacted, like if they were like, oh my gosh, that's my community member, if they were like, yay, go, like I don't know.
Yeah, no, there was resistance for sure. So there was two things, right? People trying to organize and resist, but at the same time trying to survive in the time of crisis, right? They were trying to also make ends meet. So the organizing was limited because they didn't have the resources to really put aside and say, I will help you find employment, I will help you with food or other needs, clothing or other needs, so that you can sustain your family until you find employment. And it's not like today either, right? That we have national organizations that are dedicated to protect the civil rights of citizens in different ethnic and racial backgrounds. We only have very few organizations back in the 30s that were dedicated to protecting the rights and civil liberties of Mexican and ethnic Mexicans. So it's a different time, right? And so most of the organizing and resisting was by neighborhoods and family members who were trying to support each other. But then when the resources run out, then they had no other option but to be removed or leave at their own accord by coercion or no other choice or voluntarily sometimes.
Kind of going off what you just said, were there like punishments for people in these communities who tried to help the people that they were trying to get rid of, or?
No, it wasn't criminalized because it wasn't a law. Repatriation and banishment was never formalized as a law or a legal policy for Mexicans or ethnic Mexicans. So there was no punishment for people assisting them, right? Yeah, so whenever it's a law, then there can be punishment for going against the law. But in this case, it was just an informal policy that began as a local governments and escalated to state governments, national and binational systems that remove people, but no real punishment.
All right, we have nearly 6:30. I would say, let's join me in thanking Professor Ramírez for this.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks so much for participating. This was a great discussion. Before we leave, just one quick request. So I have this list. For those of you who haven't like logged in with this QR code, could I ask you to just put your name on this list so that we know that you've been here? So I guess this will be important for like future, like the future of the history club. So, and I just want to reiterate that in December, we're gonna have our next talk, and I hope to see you there again. So thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.